We are told, once again, that history is knocking at the door of the Middle East. The headlines are loud, the graphics are dramatic, and the language is familiar. Warships repositioned, warplanes on alert, missiles counted and categorized like items on a balance sheet. Iran versus the United States, they say. But before we accept this framing, before we let the spectacle overwhelm our judgment, we need to slow down and ask a deeper question. Who benefits when war is made to look inevitable? The buildup of U.S. warships, warplanes, and missiles in the Middle East is often presented to the public as a matter of urgent security, but in reality, it functions as a carefully staged political performance. These deployments are not spontaneous reactions to sudden threats. They are deliberate, calculated acts meant to communicate power. When an aircraft carrier strike group moves into strategic waters, it is not only preparing for potential combat, it is sending a signal to multiple audiences at once: rivals, allies, financial markets, and domestic voters. The military hardware becomes a language, and the message it speaks is dominance, control, and the willingness to escalate. This performance relies heavily on visibility. Warships are announced, tracked, photographed, and discussed endlessly across news channels. Warplanes are shown taxiing on runways. Missiles are displayed in briefing rooms. Maps light up with arrows and circles. None of this is accidental. Power that is hidden cannot intimidate, and power that is not broadcast cannot shape public opinion. The spectacle reassures allies who depend on American protection, warns adversaries of consequences, and conditions the public to accept militarization as normal, even necessary. What is rarely discussed is how this performance substitutes for diplomacy. The moment warships move, negotiations fade into the background. Military presence becomes the main instrument of foreign policy, pushing political dialogue aside. The logic is simple but dangerous: strength first, conversation later. Over time, this approach trains policymakers to believe that credibility comes from force rather than compromise, and that appearing weak is more damaging than provoking conflict. In such a framework, restraint is seen as failure, while escalation is framed as leadership. This performance also serves domestic political purposes. Military displays create a sense of urgency and unity, especially during periods of internal division. When the nation is told that an external enemy threatens stability, attention shifts away from economic inequality, social unrest, and political dysfunction at home. War readiness becomes a distraction, a rallying point that temporarily silences criticism. The language of national security is powerful precisely because it discourages questioning. Once the stage is set, dissent can be labeled as irresponsible or unpatriotic. Importantly, this theatrical aspect of war normalizes permanent military presence. Bases, fleets, and aerial patrols become background noise rather than extraordinary measures. The public grows accustomed to constant readiness, constant tension, constant preparation for conflict. This normalization benefits institutions that thrive on continuity: defense departments, intelligence agencies, and arms manufacturers. A performance that never ends justifies budgets that never shrink and strategies that are never reassessed. In this sense, war becomes less an event and more a condition. The threat does not need to materialize for the performance to succeed. The mere possibility of conflict sustains the narrative, legitimizes authority, and preserves existing power structures. The audience is taught to focus on the display itself: the ships, the jets, the missiles, rather than the underlying question of whether such performances actually produce security or simply perpetuate a cycle of fear and dominance. The sheer scale of the American military arsenal reveals far more than a commitment to national defense. It exposes the economic priorities embedded within the political system. When warplanes are rapidly deployed, when missile systems are upgraded without hesitation, and when naval fleets operate indefinitely across the globe, the underlying message is not simply readiness, but allocation. Resources are finite, and where they flow tells us what truly matters. In this case, military strength consistently takes precedence over social investment, even in moments of domestic crisis. Defense budgets expand with remarkable ease. While public debates rage over funding for healthcare, education, housing, and infrastructure, military spending often escapes serious scrutiny. It is treated as untouchable, as if questioning it were equivalent to endangering national survival. This creates a political environment where enormous sums can be approved in the name of security, even as essential public services are told to tighten their belts. The contrast is striking. Schools compete for basic supplies, while advanced weapon systems receive blank checks. This prioritization reflects a deeper economic logic. Military spending functions as a guaranteed stream of public money into private hands. Large defense contractors depend on continuous government contracts, and those contracts depend on a perception of ongoing threat. The result is a self reinforcing cycle in which fear justifies spending, spending sustains corporate profit, and corporate influence reinforces policies that maintain fear. In this system, the arsenal is not just a tool of defense, it is an economic engine. Warplanes and missiles are often defended as job creators, a familiar argument used to shield military budgets from criticism. Yet this framing hides a crucial reality. Public funds invested in civilian sectors, renewable energy, public transportation, healthcare, education, could generate employment without the risks and destruction associated with militarization. The choice to prioritize weapons production over social development is not inevitable, it is political. It reflects whose interests carry weight in policy decisions and whose needs are considered secondary. The global reach of the U.S. arsenal further underscores these priorities. Maintaining military dominance across distant regions requires enormous logistical support, constant maintenance, and perpetual upgrades. This global posture is expensive by design, and its costs are absorbed by taxpayers rather than by the private entities that profit from it. Meanwhile, the benefits of this spending are concentrated among corporations and investors with close ties to political power, widening economic inequality at home. By framing military expenditure as a necessity rather than a choice, leaders avoid confronting its opportunity costs. Every missile system funded represents resources not spent on addressing poverty, public health, or crumbling infrastructure. The arsenal thus becomes a mirror reflecting national values, showing a system more willing to invest in instruments of destruction than in the conditions that produce social stability. When economic priorities are revealed in this way, the question is no longer whether the country can afford a different path, but why that path remains consistently excluded from serious consideration. Iran occupies a familiar and necessary position within the architecture of American foreign policy, the permanent adversary. This role is not accidental, nor is it purely the result of recent events. It is constructed over time through political rhetoric, selective history, and strategic omission. By repeatedly portraying Iran as an existential threat, Policymakers create a simplified narrative that justifies military buildup, sanctions, and regional intervention while discouraging deeper public understanding of the conflict's origins. The construction of Iran as an enemy relies heavily on abstraction. Iran is rarely presented as a society of millions of people with diverse political views, economic struggles, and internal debates. Instead, it is reduced to a single hostile entity, defined almost entirely by its government and its military capabilities. This abstraction allows complex realities to be replaced with fear inducing symbols, missiles, nuclear facilities, and aggressive slogans. Nuance becomes unnecessary when an enemy must remain clear and constant. Historical context is often stripped away in this process. Decades of foreign intervention, economic sanctions, and regional power struggles are minimized or ignored. Sanctions that have deeply affected civilian life are reframed as targeted measures, even when their broader social consequences are well documented. When hardship inside Iran is mentioned at all, it is often used as evidence of the government's failure rather than as a result of external pressure. This selective storytelling ensures that responsibility flows in only one direction. The enemy narrative also serves a strategic function domestically. A clearly defined adversary simplifies political messaging and unifies otherwise divided audiences. Complex policy debates become unnecessary when moral certainty is asserted. By framing Iran as inherently aggressive, leaders can present military expansion as defensive and preemptive, even when it occurs far from American shores. The language of prevention replaces the language of provocation, and escalation is reframed as restraint. Internationally, this constructed image pressures allies to align with US strategy. Countries that question the narrative risk being labeled as weak or unreliable. Diplomatic alternatives are sidelined because engaging with a constructed enemy is portrayed as appeasement. Over time, the possibility of mutual de escalation becomes politically costly, not because it lacks merit, but because it threatens the coherence of the enemy image that justifies existing policies. Perhaps most importantly, the construction of Iran as a permanent threat obscures the cyclical nature of hostility. Military posturing and sanctions provoke responses, which are then cited as proof of aggression, reinforcing the original narrative. Each side's actions become evidence for the other's claims, while the structural incentives driving confrontation remain unexamined. In this cycle, the enemy is not merely discovered, it is continuously produced and maintained to sustain a foreign policy framework that depends on confrontation for its legitimacy. Behind the language of national security and strategic necessity lies a powerful economic reality: war is profitable. The expansion of military presence, the constant upgrading of weapon systems, and the normalization of permanent readiness are deeply intertwined with corporate interests that benefit directly from conflict or the threat of it. Defense contractors do not merely respond to policy decisions, they actively shape them through lobbying, political donations, and revolving door relationships between government and industry. Every escalation in tension translates into contracts. Missiles must be replenished, aircraft must be modernized, surveillance systems must be expanded. These requirements generate billions of dollars in guaranteed government spending, often with minimal public oversight. Unlike civilian industries, defense corporations face little market risk. Their primary customer is the state, and their profits are secured through long-term agreements justified by national security concerns. This arrangement transforms war from a policy failure into a stable business model. Corporate influence extends far beyond manufacturing. Think tanks, media commentators, and policy advisors frequently have financial or institutional ties to defense interests. Their analyses dominate public discourse, shaping how threats are perceived and how solutions are framed. Military responses are presented as realistic and responsible, while diplomatic or economic alternatives are dismissed as weak or impractical. This intellectual ecosystem reinforces a narrow range of acceptable policy options, all of which sustain demand for military spending. The revolving door between government and industry further blurs the line between public service and private profit. Former military officials and policymakers often transition into lucrative positions within defense companies, while industry executives are appointed to advisory roles within government. This circulation of personnel creates shared assumptions and mutual incentives. Decisions about war and peace are made within a culture that views military expansion as both normal and beneficial, not only strategically but economically. The global dimension of arms sales magnifies these dynamics. Weapons developed for one conflict are marketed to allies across the world, spreading militarization and locking other nations into dependency on American systems. Regional tensions become opportunities for export growth, and instability becomes a sales pitch. In this context, peace represents a threat to profitability, while prolonged conflict ensures sustained demand. What is most troubling is how effectively this system hides in plain sight. The public is encouraged to view military spending as a necessary cost of safety, not as a transfer of wealth from taxpayers to private corporations. Discussions of profit are overshadowed by patriotic language, making it difficult to question motives without appearing disloyal, yet the incentives remain clear. When corporate earnings rise alongside global instability, it becomes impossible to separate strategic decisions from economic interests. War, in this framework, is not an unfortunate last resort, but an integrated component of a political economy built around continuous militarization. Military escalation is almost always discussed in terms of strategy, deterrence, and geopolitical balance, but rarely in terms of human consequence. When warships move into position and warplanes are placed on high alert, the conversation focuses on capabilities and readiness, not on the lives that will be disrupted or destroyed if those capabilities are used. This omission is not accidental. The human cost of war complicates the narrative, and complexity is inconvenient for policies that rely on public acceptance rather than informed consent. In the Middle East, the human consequences of militarization are immediate and enduring. Civilian populations live under the constant shadow of potential conflict, where uncertainty becomes a permanent condition. Infrastructure built over decades can be destroyed in days, and recovery can take generations. Hospitals, schools, and water systems become collateral damage, even when they are not direct targets. The language of precision strikes and smart weapons obscures the reality that no military action occurs in a social vacuum. Displacement is one of the most devastating and least discussed outcomes. Military escalation forces families to flee their homes, often with no guarantee of return. Refugee crises strain neighboring countries and destabilize entire regions, creating cycles of poverty and insecurity. These displaced populations are then treated as secondary problems, humanitarian concerns detached from the military decisions that created them. Responsibility is fragmented, and accountability is diluted. At home, the human cost takes a different but equally serious form. Vast military expenditures divert resources from social programs that directly affect quality of life. Communities face underfunded schools, limited access to health care, and deteriorating infrastructure while defense budgets continue to grow. This trade off is rarely presented honestly to the public. The suffering caused by neglect is less visible than the destruction caused by bombs, but it is no less real. The psychological toll of permanent war readiness is also ignored. Soldiers and their families live with long term stress, trauma, and reintegration challenges that persist long after deployments end. Civilians absorb a constant stream of fear based messaging that normalizes anxiety and suspicion. A society conditioned to expect conflict becomes less capable of empathy and less willing to imagine alternatives to violence. By excluding these human costs from serious policy discussions, militarization is made to appear cleaner, more rational, and more controlled than it truly is. Decisions are reduced to calculations of risk and reward, stripped of moral weight. When lives are treated as abstractions, it becomes easier to justify actions that would otherwise be unacceptable. This systematic erasure of human impact allows cycles of escalation to continue without confronting their true consequences, ensuring that the price of war is paid not by those who decide, but by those who have no voice in the decision making process. Fear has long been one of the most effective instruments of political control, and in moments of international tension, it becomes especially powerful. When leaders warn of imminent threats, hostile adversaries, and unavoidable conflict, fear reshapes public perception and narrows the range of acceptable responses. The question is no longer whether escalation is wise, but whether it is necessary. In this environment, urgency replaces deliberation, and policy decisions are rushed under the pressure of manufactured crises. The framing of war as unavoidable plays a central role in this process. By presenting conflict as a forced response rather than a political choice, leaders absolve themselves of responsibility for its consequences. The public is encouraged to believe that there is no alternative, that hesitation equals danger, and that questioning the narrative could invite catastrophe. This framing discourages democratic debate and transforms complex geopolitical issues into matters of survival that must be handled by experts behind closed doors. Media amplification intensifies this dynamic. Continuous coverage, dramatic language, and repeated imagery of military hardware reinforce a sense of impending danger. Viewers are immersed in a cycle of alertness that leaves little room for reflection or skepticism. Fear driven narratives dominate airtime, while dissenting voices are marginalized or framed as unrealistic. The result is a public discourse shaped less by evidence and more by emotional response. Fear also serves to consolidate power. Under the banner of national security, governments expand surveillance, restrict civil liberties, and increase executive authority. These measures are often introduced as temporary responses to extraordinary threats, yet they frequently become permanent features of governance. Once fear has justified the expansion of state power, rolling it back becomes politically difficult, even when the original threat diminishes. Economically, fear legitimizes extraordinary spending. Defense budgets grow rapidly when the public is convinced that safety is at risk. Social investments, by contrast, are portrayed as secondary concerns that can wait until stability is restored. This creates a hierarchy of needs defined by anxiety rather than by long term societal well being. A fearful population is more likely to accept inequality and sacrifice when those sacrifices are framed as necessary for protection. Over time, governing through fear alters the relationship between citizens and the state. Trust is replaced by dependence, and participation gives way to obedience. People are encouraged to look upward for protection rather than inward for collective solutions. In such a climate, peace becomes difficult to imagine, not because it is impossible, but because fear has reshaped expectations. When anxiety is normalized and conflict is anticipated, the conditions for perpetual militarization are firmly established, allowing power to reproduce itself through the continuous management of perceived threats.